A woman stands in the doorway of her house at night, loading bread and wine and roasted grain onto the backs of donkeys. Her hands are moving fast. Her mind is moving faster. In a few minutes, she will ride out alone. No soldiers, no husband, no plan except the one she is building in her own head as she walks toward 400 armed men who are already on their way to kill everyone she loves. You don't know her name yet, but you know this feeling. The moment before you do the one thing that can't be undone. History remembers the kings. It remembers the generals, the prophets, the men whose names get carved into monuments and printed in bold at the top of the chapter. But there is a pattern hiding underneath all of that, a pattern most readers walk right past. 5 times in Scripture, the entire future of a nation and the bloodline that leads to Jesus himself did not turn on a king's decree. It turned on a wife's decision. In a tent, in a doorway, on a threshing floor, in a room where no man of power was even watching. This is not a story about kings. This is not a story about generals. This is not a story about the men whose names filled the history books of their day. This is a story about the wives standing just behind them, the ones who moved when everyone else froze. You are about to meet 5 of them. Some you have heard of. One of them you may never have looked at closely, not really. By the end, you will not be able to read their husbands' stories the same way again, because you will see who is actually holding history together the whole time. We will get to the woman in the doorway, the one loading donkeys in the dark, riding out to stop a massacre before it starts. But not yet. First, you need to understand where this pattern began, with a woman who was promised the whole future of a nation and then handed over to a foreign king to save her husband's life. Her name was Sarah, and what happened to her should make you angry before it makes you believe. Sarah was not always Sarah. For most of her life, she was called Sarai, and she was married to a man named Abraham, who believed, or said he believed, that God had promised him a nation of descendants too large to count. There was only one problem. Sarai could not have children, and she was beautiful, beautiful enough that it nearly got her husband killed twice. Here's what most people miss when they read this story fast. When a famine drove Abraham and Sarai down into Egypt, Abraham did not protect his wife. He used her. He told her to say she was his sister, not his wife, because he was afraid Pharaoh's men would kill him to take her for the harem. So Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's house. Not once. Years later, in a place called Gerar, it happened again, with a different king and the same excuse. Think about that for a moment. The woman who was supposed to carry the covenant, the promise that would eventually lead to Israel, to David, to Jesus himself, was twice handed over to protect someone else's life. And she said nothing. She went. Twice. You would expect a woman treated that way to disappear from the story, bitter and broken. Instead, decades later, when 3 visitors tell her aging husband that she will finally have the son she was promised, Sarah stands behind the tent flap and laughs. Not politely, but from somewhere deep and disbelieving. She has waited so long and been used so badly that hope itself sounds like a joke to her now. And yet, that impossible son comes anyway. Isaac, the first link in a chain none of them could see yet. But it gets stranger. The next woman in this pattern was not even an Israelite. She was not a wife when her story begins. She was something the religious people of her own culture, and often ours, would rather look away from. Her name was Rahab, and she ran a house on the wall of Jericho. Some translations soften what she was. The Hebrew word used for her is blunt. She was a prostitute, or, as the first-century Jewish historian Josephus described her, an innkeeper who ran a house where travelers stayed the night. Either way, she was a woman with no status, no protection, and no reason to care what happened to a foreign army marching toward her city. 2 Israelite spies came to her house to scout Jericho before the attack. The king's men came looking for them, and Rahab, a woman with everything to lose and nothing to gain, lied to protect 2 strangers from another nation, hid them under stalks of flax drying on her roof, and lowered them down the outside of the city wall on a rope in the middle of the night. Here's the part nobody tells you. She didn't do it for free. She made a deal. "Save my family," she said, "when your army comes back to destroy this city. Tie a scarlet cord in this window, so your soldiers know which house to pass over." And they agreed. When Jericho fell, every other house in that city was destroyed. One house was left standing, Rahab's house, because of a scarlet cord in a window, tied there by a woman with a ruined reputation and a mind sharp enough to negotiate with an invading army. Stay with me, because this is where the pattern starts to feel less like a coincidence and more like a hand quietly moving pieces into place. The next woman also wasn't born an Israelite. Her name was Ruth, and she was a widow from Moab, a nation Israel usually kept at arm's length. When her Israelite husband died, Ruth had every reason to go home to her own people, remarry, rebuild her life where she belonged. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, told her to do exactly that. Ruth refused, and what she said next has been read at funerals and weddings for 3,000 years. "Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." There's a Hebrew word for what Ruth was showing here. Chesed. It gets translated kindness, but that's too soft. Chesed is loyalty that costs you something. It's the kind of love that keeps showing up long after it stopped being convenient. Ruth had no legal claim on Naomi anymore. No safety net. No promise that anything good was waiting for her in a foreign land. She went anyway. So Ruth ends up gleaning leftover grain in the fields of Bethlehem just to keep herself and Naomi alive, until a landowner named Boaz notices her. Not just her face. Her chesed. Word had already reached him about what she'd given up for a mother-in-law who wasn't even her own blood. And through a quiet, careful courtship on a threshing floor at night, Ruth becomes Boaz's wife. Their great-grandson would be a shepherd boy named David. 3 wives in. Sarah, Rahab, Ruth. A woman who was used and still became the mother of the promise. A woman with a ruined reputation who became the reason a city fell in exactly the shape God wanted. A foreign widow whose loyalty rewrote her family tree and Israel's. None of them had power. Every single one of them had a choice. And 2 stories from now, you're going to watch one of these choices stop a king from becoming a murderer on the very night before he had any idea he'd need to be forgiven for it. 3 wives down, 2 to go. And if you've been paying attention, you've probably already noticed something these women have in common. None of them were kings. None of them commanded armies. None of them held any office anyone in their world would have called powerful. What they had was a moment, one moment each, where they could freeze or they could move. And every single one of them moved. If this is opening your eyes to something in these stories you'd never noticed before, that's exactly what this channel is built for. Hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which of these women has surprised you the most so far, because the next 2 are about to raise the stakes higher than anything you've heard yet. Now we go back to where we started. The woman in the doorway, loading donkeys in the dark. Her name was Abigail, and she was married to a man named Nabal, which, in Hebrew, literally means fool, not a nickname, his actual name. And by the time this story is finished, you'll understand why nobody ever changed it. Nabal was rich. 3,000 sheep, 1,000 goats, more wealth than almost anyone in the region of Carmel. And he was, by the Bible's own blunt description, harsh and evil in his dealings, the kind of man who mistreated people simply because he could afford to. David, not yet king, still a fugitive hiding from a jealous King Saul who wanted him dead, had spent weeks protecting Nabal's shepherds out in the wilderness with his own men. No pay, no contract, just decency, extended to a stranger's flocks in a dangerous, lawless stretch of land. So when shearing season came, and it was customary to share the harvest with those who'd helped protect it, David sent 10 of his men to Nabal with a simple, respectful request for provisions. Nabal's answer was contempt. "Who is David?" he said. "There are plenty of servants these days who break away from their masters." He treated the man who would become the greatest king in Israel's history like a runaway slave begging at his gate. David's response was immediate, and it was not measured. "Strap on your swords," he told his men. 400 of them saddled up that night with one destination, Nabal's household. David intended to kill every male in it before morning. Not just Nabal, everyone. Now watch what happens next. One of Nabal's servants, who clearly knew exactly what kind of man he worked for, ran straight to Abigail. Not to Nabal, to her. He laid out the whole disaster. What David's men had done for them, what Nabal had said in return, and the small detail that 400 armed men were currently marching toward their home with murder already decided. Abigail did not wake her husband. She did not call a meeting. She acted. She gathered 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, 200 cakes of pressed figs, loaded it all onto donkeys, sent her servants ahead, and rode out after them, alone, toward an army that had already sworn to kill every man in her household by sunrise. She found David in a mountain ravine. And here's the part worth slowing down for. She didn't just hand over the food and hope for the best. She got down off the donkey, bowed to the ground in front of him, and said something that stopped a future king cold. She told him that avenging this insult with a household massacre wasn't worthy of the man God had already chosen to be king over Israel, that blood guilt like this would follow him onto the throne. She reminded David, to his face, of who he actually was, before he could become someone smaller than that. David listened. He called off the attack. He told her, and this line has echoed for 3,000 years, that she had kept him, that day, from doing something he would have regretted for the rest of his life. Abigail rode home. Nabal, meanwhile, was throwing himself a feast, drunk, celebrating like a man who had no idea he'd nearly gotten everyone he loved killed by his own arrogance. Abigail said nothing to him that night. In the morning, when he was sober, she told him everything. And Nabal's heart, the text says, failed inside him. He became like a stone. 10 days later, he was dead. David heard the news and sent for Abigail. Not to console her, to marry her. Pay attention to this, because it's easy to miss the size of what just happened. This wasn't a story about avoiding an awkward family conflict. Abigail stopped the future king of Israel from committing a mass killing on the eve of his own coronation, the kind of bloodstain that could have followed his entire reign, the kind of story his enemies would have told for generations. One woman, riding alone into an army, with nothing but food and a few sentences of courage, is the reason David's legacy wasn't built on the corpses of an innocent household. For wives, for moments where history could have gone one way, and instead went another, because a woman without a title, a woman nobody would have thought to interview for the history books, refused to freeze. There's one more, and she doesn't just save a household or a bloodline. She saves a nation that hasn't been born yet. Her name was Esther, and by the time her story begins, she is an orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai in the heart of the Persian Empire, a kingdom that stretched from India to Ethiopia, ruled by a king named Cyrus, who could execute a person for the crime of walking into his throne room uninvited. Esther was Jewish, and in the palace, she was told to hide it. When the king's search for a new queen brought young women from across the empire into his harem, Esther was taken in among them. Not chosen, taken. She had no say in this. A Jewish girl, absorbed into the machinery of a foreign empire, her real identity a secret she carried every single day, in a palace where being found out could have ended her life. She became queen, but queen of a kingdom that, at any moment, could turn on her people without her even knowing until it was too late. And then it happened. A palace official named Haman, proud, vindictive, furious that one Jewish man named Mordecai refused to bow to him, convinced the king to sign a decree. Not an insult, not a punishment, an extermination order scheduled for a single day against every Jewish person in the empire. Men, women, children, all of them. Here is what most people don't understand about Persian law, and it's the detail that makes this story almost unbearable. Once the king sealed a decree with his ring, it could not be reversed, not even by the king himself. The order to destroy an entire people was now, legally, unstoppable, unless someone found another way around it. Mordecai sent word to Esther. Someone had to go before the king and beg for her people's lives. There was only one problem. Nobody, not even the queen, was allowed to approach the king's inner court without being summoned. The penalty for walking in uninvited was death, unless the king, on sight, extended his golden scepter toward you. Esther had not been summoned in 30 days. Mordecai's message to her is one of the most quietly devastating lines in the entire Bible. Do not think, he told her, that because you live in the palace you will somehow escape this when it comes. And then, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This is not a story about a queen with a title. This is not a story about a woman with guaranteed influence. This is not a story about someone who had any real power at all. She was a hidden minority inside a foreign court, one accusation away from losing everything she had. This is a story about a woman who decided that her one small, terrifying window of access was worth risking her life to use. Esther's answer to Mordecai has been quoted for 2,000 years. "Gather everyone," she said. "Fast for me, and then I will go in to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Picture the walk itself. Down a corridor she'd walked 100 times before. Except this time every step could be her last. No idea if the scepter would rise or if guards would already be moving toward her. That 30 seconds before an irreversible decision. Maybe you felt a smaller version of it. The hallway before a hard conversation you can't take back. The phone in your hand before you make the call. The door you're about to knock on with news you can't unsay. Esther felt that, multiplied by every life she was carrying with her into that room. The king raised the scepter. Esther didn't accuse Haman immediately. She invited him and the king to a banquet. Then another. And at the second banquet, with Haman sitting right there, comfortable, unsuspecting, Esther finally said the words she'd been carrying for weeks. "A decree has been signed to destroy me and my people." And she named the man responsible, sitting 3 feet away from her. Haman was executed on the very gallows he'd built for Mordecai. The Jewish people were saved, not because the original decree was undone, since it legally couldn't be, but because a second decree, allowing the Jews to defend themselves, went out under the king's authority before the appointed day arrived. And here's where the whole pattern finally closes. Sarah, used, then finally mother of the promised son. Rahab, a woman on the margin of her own society, whose choice put her directly in the bloodline of King David and, generations later, of Jesus himself, named openly in his genealogy in the first chapter of Matthew. Ruth, a foreign widow whose loyalty made her David's great-grandmother, also named in that same genealogy. Abigail, who kept David's throne from beginning under blood guilt. And Esther, who made sure there was still a nation left standing for any of that promised line to survive in. 5 wives, 5 moments with no king in the room. 5 choices that no history book credits to the men whose names top the page. So what do you do with 5 women like this? Here's the first thing worth taking with you. Every single turning point in this video happened through someone the culture around them had already written off, overlooked, or underestimated. A barren old woman, a prostitute, a foreign widow, a wife married to a fool, a hidden minority in a foreign court. Not one of them looked, on paper, like someone history would remember. And yet here they are, 5 names still being spoken 3,000 years later, holding together the exact bloodline that leads to Jesus Christ. Here's the second thing. You probably don't feel like you're standing at the hinge point of anything right now. Neither did Abigail, most mornings, married to a man like Nabal. Neither did Ruth, gleaning leftover grain just to survive one more week. But the decision that mattered most in each of their lives didn't arrive wearing a sign that said, "This is the important one." It arrived looking like an ordinary Tuesday. A servant at the door. A mother-in-law packing to leave. A moment to speak up or stay quiet. You may be closer to a hinge point than you think. And here's the third thing, and it's the one I want you to sit with. God did not need a throne to change the world. He didn't need an army, a title, or a man with a famous name standing in the room. 5 times, he worked through women nobody expected, women with no power, no platform, no guarantee it would work, and every single time, they were enough. That means the door isn't closed for you either. You don't need a crown. You never did. Which of these 5 wives do you think you'd have had the courage to be? Sarah, waiting decades for a promise that felt like a joke. Rahab, risking everything for 2 strangers. Ruth, walking away from everything familiar out of loyalty. Abigail, riding alone toward 400 swords. Or Esther, walking a corridor she might not walk back out of. Tell me below. I read every single one. History remembers the kings. But it was never really about the kings.